Looking back, it feels like everything was perfect until it wasn't. If you'd asked me a few years ago, I would have told you Lynette and I had the kind of marriage people envied. On the outside, we had it all. A beautiful home in a neighborhood where people put up seasonal decorations and knew each other's names, careers that we were proud of, and this understanding. Hell, I thought we were partners, best friends. She had this laugh that would light up a room, and when she smiled at me, it felt like I was the only guy in the world. I worked hard to give us the life we had, and Lynette did her part too. She's a sales manager, and she'd often come home with stories about clients and deals. She was damn good at her job. Sure, sometimes that meant late nights, but I respected her work. It mattered to her, and I was proud. She'd always made it clear that family came first, though, or at least it's what I thought. Weekends were ours, lunches with friends, day trips, quiet nights in. People called us the ideal couple, and back then, I thought we really were. But then things started to change, and I didn't notice right away. It crept up on me slowly, like a shadow getting longer as the sun starts to set. It was little things at first. Lynette started staying later at work, and when she came home, she looked different. She started wearing new clothes, expensive stuff, flashy jewelry. I don't know, maybe I should have been happy she was treating herself, but it felt off. This wasn't her. She'd always been practical, said those things didn't matter. And then there was the way she acted around me, colder, distant. I'd try to get close, and she'd pull away, saying she was tired or stressed from work. I remember lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering when we'd gone from late-night talks and laughter to silent, separate lives. One night it really hit me. She was sitting next to me on the couch, scrolling through her phone, smiling at something, but when I leaned over to see, she angled the screen away. Said it was just work. But who gets that kind of grin from a work email? I didn't push it. Told myself I was being paranoid, overthinking. Then, a few days later, we had dinner at her parents' house. Typical family night, everyone laughing, her mom going on about some cooking show. But Lynette got a message and practically jumped out of her seat to answer it. She disappeared for a few minutes, and when she came back, she was all flustered. When I asked, she brushed it off, said it was just work again. But we never hid things like that from each other before. Later, I met up with my buddy Miles. He's been my rock through so much, and if there's anyone who can call me on my crap, it's him. We were sitting there, nursing our beers, and I told him about Lynette's late nights, the new clothes, the secrecy. He listened, nodded, and said, "Man, don't jump to conclusions, but keep an eye on things." Wise words, sure, but easier said than done. I was already watching, already waiting for her to make some kind of move that would make it all make sense, or tear my world apart. Then came the party. Just a casual gathering, close friends, laughs, a couple of drinks, nothing unusual. Lynette looked amazing that night, all dolled up in this new dress, the kind she wouldn't have even considered before. But when she got a text, she stiffened, like someone had thrown cold water over her. She murmured something about needing some air and slipped out of the room, phone in hand. I followed quietly just to see what she was up to. She was standing in the hallway, staring down at her phone with this soft smile, the kind she used to save for me. My stomach twisted, but I kept quiet. When she finally came back, I pretended not to notice, but inside, doubts were eating me alive. That night, lying next to her, I felt like I was lying next to a stranger. I wanted to confront her, to ask her outright if there was someone else. But something stopped me. Maybe it was fear, or maybe deep down, I just didn't want to know. Things didn't get better after that. It's like every little thing she did started to seem suspicious. The perfume I didn't recognize, the extra cash withdrawals from our account that didn't match up with anything I knew about. I'd ask her casually, "Hey, what's up with the extra expenses?" And she'd brush it off, saying it was for client dinners. But since when did those happen so often? And why wasn't I ever invited? And it wasn't just the money. Lynette had become overly nice. Out of nowhere, she'd plan these dinners, talk about taking a vacation, even bought me a watch one day. Said it was just because. But I could feel it, something was off. She wasn't doing this out of love. It was like she was trying to cover something up, like a kid with chocolate smeared on their face, saying they didn't touch the candy jar. By now, the suspicion had rooted itself deep inside me. Miles' advice kept ringing in my head, But watching my own wife act like a stranger had put me on edge, constantly trying to piece together a puzzle I didn't even have all the pieces for. And that was when I knew I had to do something. Just keeping quiet, sitting in the dark, and hoping for the best. It wasn't enough. I needed answers. I needed to know if the woman I'd given my life to, the woman I'd trusted, was lying right to my face. After that party, I knew things weren't going to go back to normal, not like they were before. It was like a switch had flipped inside me, something I couldn't ignore any longer. Every smile she gave me, every touch, it all felt hollow, like she was going through the motions. I'd sit there watching her, trying to pick up on little clues, looking for any tiny slip-up. It felt like I was living with a stranger in my own home, and all I wanted were answers. So I started with the obvious stuff, things that should have been right in front of me, but that I'd overlooked, chalking them up to paranoia. The first place I looked was our finances. We'd always been open about money. She had her own accounts for work expenses, but our personal ones were shared. As I went through our bank statements, something jumped out. There were dinners and cash withdrawals from places I'd never heard of, let alone visited with her. When I finally confronted her, she brushed me off with a tight smile and a "work's been busy. These are all client dinners." But how often do these client dinners happen? And why the hell was she paying in cash? Every time I tried to ask, she'd get this defensive edge, as if I were prying into something I had no business questioning. She'd say things like, "You know how my job is, Dexter," and give me this patronizing smile. A year ago, I would have bought that without hesitation, but now it sounded rehearsed, like she'd practiced every line. Funny enough, right after I started asking, she began acting extra sweet. I'll never forget the night. She came home with a bottle of wine and told me she'd made reservations at this fancy restaurant downtown. Said she wanted us to have a nice night out. At first, I thought she was just trying to make things right between us, but it didn't take long to realize that her efforts were too calculated, too forced. It felt like she was putting on a show, and I was the only one left in the dark. Then there was the talk about vacations. Out of nowhere, she'd bring up some trip idea, like we'd pack up and get away for a few weeks. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to think she actually cared. But deep down, all I could think about was whether this was some twisted form of guilt, her way of balancing out whatever she was hiding. It only made me trust her less. One night, after I couldn't take it anymore, I met up with Miles. He's one of the only people who knows the whole story, someone who'd never feed me a line just to keep me calm. We sat in his garage with a couple of beers, and I spilled everything, all the dinners, the fake kindness, the dodging of every question. "So, what are you going to do?" he asked, staring into his bottle. "I don't know," I said, and for the first time, I really didn't. But as the silence stretched between us, I knew I couldn't just sit around waiting. I needed proof, solid proof, if I was ever going to confront her without looking like some paranoid idiot. That's when I decided to hire a private investigator. The whole idea felt surreal at first, like something out of a bad movie. But what else was I supposed to do? Lynette was smart. She covered her tracks, hid everything behind that damn professional front of hers. I found a guy online who had good reviews and met him at a little diner outside town. The place was empty, which was fine by me. I wasn't exactly eager to have this conversation in public. The PI was an older guy, looked like he'd seen it all. I laid out the situation for him, told him about the late nights, the dinners, the changes in her. He nodded, taking notes, and then he looked at me with this kind of sympathetic look, like he'd seen the same story 100 times. "Look, I'll be honest with you," he said. "If there's something going on, we'll find it." I left that meeting feeling a strange mix of relief and dread. It was out of my hands now, at least a little, but the waiting, that was the hard part. Each day that passed felt like an eternity. I'd wake up, see her getting ready for work, all dressed up and sprayed with that expensive perfume I hadn't smelled on her before, and I'd wonder if today was another day she'd spend with him, whoever he was. One time, I couldn't help myself and asked about the perfume. She gave a short laugh and said, "Oh, just a colleague's. We were testing samples for some project." She said it so smoothly, like she'd been rehearsing that line, too. The investigator sent me updates here and there, nothing big at first. I'd get a text with just the words, "following lead." It drove me insane. I'd sit in my car after work, staring at my phone, willing it to go off with some concrete proof. I just needed to see it in black and white, something undeniable, so I wouldn't feel like I was the crazy one. Lynette's behavior only got weirder. She'd bring me coffee in the morning, something she hadn't done in years, or suggest we watch a movie together like we were in college again. But it was all a farce. I could see right through it, every forced smile and empty gesture. And the more she tried to play this role, the angrier I got. It was like she thought she could keep fooling me with a few cheap tricks. And as the weeks dragged on, my mind started going to some pretty dark places. Every time she left, every time she stayed late at work, I pictured her with someone else. I could see it all in my head. The dinners, the laughter, the way she'd look at him the way she used to look at me. It got to the point where I could barely stand being in the same room with her, the resentment just bubbling under the surface, waiting for one wrong word to set it off. But I kept my cool. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that blowing up on her without anything to back it up would only give her a chance to twist it back on me. No, I had to be smart about this. So I played along with her little act, smiled when she did, pretended to enjoy our dinners, knowing that soon enough, I'd have the truth. The PI promised he'd have everything soon, just a few more leads to chase down. I held on to that, even when it felt like I was falling apart inside. One night, as we sat across from each other at dinner, she reached over, putting her hand on mine with this look of concern. "Dexter," she said, "you've seemed distant lately. Is something wrong?" I almost laughed right then and there. The nerve of her, sitting there with that innocent face, pretending like she hadn't been sneaking around. But I forced myself to stay calm, just shook my head and said, "Just work stress. Nothing to worry about." She gave me this soft, almost pitying smile, and for a second, I thought she actually believed her own lie. Those weeks were hell. Every single day worse than the last. Every interaction a twisted reminder of the life we used to have. I felt like a ghost in my own house, just drifting through, waiting for the truth to come crashing down. I wanted to scream, to confront her, to throw everything I suspected in her face and watch her squirm. But I kept quiet. Just a little longer, I told myself, just a little longer until I had the proof. And so I waited, clinging to the hope that when the time came, I'd finally have the answers, and Lynette would have nowhere left to hide. Part 3. The discovery of the affair. I remember the moment I got the call from the investigator like it was yesterday. My phone buzzed in the middle of a quiet afternoon, and seeing his name pop up set off an ache in my gut that I hadn't felt since I first started suspecting her. He didn't mince words. "Dexter," he said, "we've got what you're looking for. Photos, messages, the works." There was a pause, and then, almost apologetically, he added, "I can't say this is easy to see. You'll want to brace yourself." When I finally saw the evidence, it felt like someone had driven a nail through my chest. Photos of her laughing over dinner with this guy. Some big-shot client I'd heard her mention before in passing, but never thought much about. And then, there was in black and white. Hotel reservations, late-night messages, all the things I'd feared. It was real. Every suspicion, every doubt. I'd been right. I'll be honest. Part of me wanted to throw something, break every photo frame in the house, scream at the top of my lungs. But I knew I couldn't afford to lose it, not now. I had to keep my emotions in check, as hard as that was. I had to be smart about how I handled this. Confronting her in a blind rage would only give her the upper hand, and there was no way I'd let her get out of this without facing the truth. So, I waited. I forced myself to act normal, as if I hadn't seen anything. I watched her walk through the door that evening, smiling at me like nothing had changed, completely oblivious. And I knew that tonight was the night. I had to confront her. After she'd settled in, I finally spoke up, trying to keep my voice as calm as I could. "So, how was your meeting?" I asked, watching her reaction. She blinked, clearly caught off guard by my tone. "Oh, she started a little too quickly, same as always. Just a lot of talk and planning." I pressed a little further, still careful not to let my anger slip through. "And where was it this time?" "Somewhere new." Her face grew tense, her eyes darting away from mine. She mumbled something about a restaurant I knew for a fact was nowhere near where she'd been photographed. That's when I leaned forward, my gaze steady. "Lynette," I said quietly, "I know you're lying. I know where you really were." She froze, her face paling as she stared at me, the reality of the situation finally sinking in. I could see the fear in her eyes, the way she frantically tried to piece together some sort of story to explain it away. "Dexter, please, it's not what it looks like," she stammered. "It was a mistake. A one-time thing, I swear. It was just for work. He's a major client, and I needed to keep things smooth for my job. I didn't mean for it to go this far." The rage I'd been holding back nearly boiled over at that moment. The nerve of her, standing there and trying to pass it off as a business decision. She looked at me with those wide, pleading eyes, as if she actually thought I'd just forgive her, pretend like it never happened. But I wasn't going to make this easy for her. "So, you're telling me you've risked our entire marriage over a one-time mistake with some client?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper, but I could tell it shook her. She nodded, looking down, and then whispered, "I'm sorry, Dexter. It was just one time, a horrible mistake. I regret it, I do. I love you." If it weren't for the evidence I had in my back pocket, I might have believed her. But that ship had sailed. There was no coming back from this, and I'd be damned if I let her manipulate me. "One time, huh?" I said, crossing my arms and fixing her with a cold stare. "Then explain the messages. Explain the hotel. Explain why I have photos of you meeting this guy not just once, but multiple times over the past few months." She went silent, her face a mask of guilt and fear. She stammered something about how it wasn't like that I was making a bigger deal out of it than it was. But I wasn't having any of it. I could see the cracks in her facade now, the way she tried to backtrack, to find an excuse that would make me just let it go. I leaned back, shaking my head, a bitter laugh escaping my throat. "You know, Lynette, I never thought you'd be the kind of person to lie right to my face. To throw our entire marriage down the drain like this. Was it worth it? All those dinners, all those meetings, did it make you feel powerful? Important?" She didn't have an answer for that, just stared down at her hands, biting her lip like some remorseful child who'd been caught with their hand in the cookie jar. But this wasn't a child's mistake, and I wasn't about to treat it like one. Even as she tried to plead with me, to tell me that it meant nothing, and that it would never happen again, I knew she was lying. I could feel it, deep down, that this wasn't just a one-time lapse. There was more she wasn't saying, more she was trying to hide, and I wasn't about to let her get away with it. After that confrontation, I kept my cool on the outside, but inside, I was a mess. Every time I looked at her, all I could see were those photos in my mind, the way she smiled at him, the way she dressed up and left me behind. It was like she'd become a stranger, someone I couldn't trust, someone I didn't even know anymore. So, I started digging on my own. I went through her phone, her computer, every scrap of evidence I could find. And the more I uncovered, the deeper her betrayal went. There were texts from other men, messages she deleted but hadn't bothered to clear from the cloud. I saw conversations that were so painfully casual, as if what she was doing was no big deal, just another part of her day. And the worst part? Some of her friends knew. They covered for her, even encouraged her, telling her that it was normal and that everyone needs a break sometimes. It was sickening reading the things she said, the way she laughed about it behind my back, sharing details with her friends like it was some kind of twisted joke. It was like my whole world had been turned upside down. Everything I'd believed, everything I thought we had, it was all a lie. She hadn't just betrayed me with some random fling. She'd built an entire life around it, a life I was never supposed to know about. But now I did know. I had all the proof I needed, and there was no way I'd let her worm her way out of this one. I could feel the anger simmering inside me, growing stronger each time I read another text, saw another photo. I wasn't the fool she thought I was, and she was about to find that out the hard way. After that first confrontation, I thought I'd seen the worst of it. I'd brace myself, thinking that whatever I found next couldn't possibly hurt me more. But I was wrong, so painfully completely wrong. One night, after Lynette had fallen asleep, I sat alone in my office, staring at her laptop. I knew her password, or at least an old one, and part of me hoped she'd changed it, that maybe I wouldn't be able to get in. But it worked. The laptop unlocked, and I was staring down the digital window to a life I was never supposed to see. The messages were there, plain as day. Her phone had been more carefully scrubbed, but on her laptop, it was like she'd left the door wide open. The first conversation I read wasn't with the guy from her office. It was with someone else entirely from years ago. And as I scrolled through, one thing became glaringly clear. This wasn't a new habit for her. It had been going on for years, multiple men, from casual flings to what looked like real relationships. Each message was like a punch to the gut. Some of the conversations dated back to the first year of our marriage, back when I thought we were still madly in love, building something strong and real. The things she said, the way she talked about me, our life, as if it were some sort of joke. It was like reading the thoughts of a stranger. One message to her friend was seared into my memory. She'd laughed about how I was clueless, said she had me wrapped around her finger. She even mocked the way I'd surprise her with little gifts or date nights, calling it cute but pointless. Her friend laughed along, telling her how she deserved a little fun and that it was normal to want a break from married life. They talked about me like I was some kind of oblivious fool, a puppet to their cruel joke. I don't think I moved for hours. Just sat there, staring at the screen, letting every horrible, painful truth sink in. It wasn't just that she'd cheated. It was the way she'd stripped away every bit of trust I'd had in her, mocked the life we'd built, and kept me in the dark with this twisted smile. Every time I'd told her how much I loved her, she'd been laughing behind my back. When the reality of it all finally hit me, I couldn't hold back. I shut the laptop, stumbled out of the office, and locked myself in the guest room. I didn't eat. I barely slept. The weight of everything I'd seen, everything I believed in, shattered me. I felt like I'd been living a lie, like our entire marriage had been some elaborate show for her entertainment. Days passed, and I kept to myself, running through every moment of our marriage in my mind, wondering how I'd been so blind, so trusting. There were moments of heartbreak, where I'd feel tears well up, and then moments where anger would flood through me so powerfully I'd have to clench my fist just to keep from breaking something. I was a mess, torn between wanting to confront her, to scream at her, and wanting to crawl into a hole and pretend none of this had happened. But in the middle of that storm, a kind of clarity set in. She'd spent years lying to me, disrespecting me, mocking me to her friends and lovers. I wasn't going to let her get away with it. I wasn't going to be the fool she thought I was, the man she could toy with and toss aside when it suited her. So, I made up my mind. The marriage was over in my heart, but if she thought she'd walk away unscathed, she was dead wrong. I'd do everything in my power to make her pay, to show her exactly what she was losing. I was done being the trusting husband. It was time to be strategic, to be ruthless. The next day, I scheduled a meeting with a lawyer. Sitting in that office, explaining everything, laying out the evidence, I could feel myself shifting. This was business now, not emotion. The lawyer, a sharp, straightforward guy, listened carefully, then nodded, telling me that we had a strong case, that with the evidence I had, I'd be able to secure a favorable settlement. But he warned me to keep calm, to play it smart. Don't tip her off, he said. Act like everything's normal until we're ready to move forward. If she knows what's coming, she could try to hide assets or make things difficult for you. That was exactly the advice I needed. I left his office with a new sense of purpose. This wasn't just about getting back at her. It was about reclaiming my life, taking control in a way I hadn't been able to before. Every interaction with Lynette after that was a test of my patience, a challenge to keep my anger under control. I'd see her laughing with friends, smiling at me over dinner, pretending like nothing was wrong, and it took every ounce of willpower not to confront her right then and there. But I stayed quiet, stayed calm. I started gathering every bit of evidence I could find, screenshots, text logs, anything that could strengthen my case. I knew the day was coming when I'd be able to look her in the eye and lay it all out, show her exactly what I knew and how badly she'd messed up. And when that day came, I wanted to be ready. There were still moments when the hurt would creep in, when I'd remember the way she used to look at me, the laughter we'd shared, and wonder if any of it had been real. But then I'd remember those messages, the mocking tone in her text to her friends, and the anger would return stronger than ever. This wasn't about love or loss anymore. It was about justice, about making sure she understood the consequences of what she'd done. In the days leading up to the divorce filing, I played my role perfectly. I'd laugh with her, listen to her stories, nod at her fake kindness, all the while knowing that soon her little charade would be over. It was almost satisfying, watching her act like she was pulling one over on me, oblivious to the storm that was about to hit her. The morning I met with the lawyer to finalize everything, I felt a strange kind of calm. I was ready. She'd taken so much from me, more than she'd ever realize. But this was my way of taking back what little control I had left. She thought she'd won, that I'd stay quiet and compliant, but she was about to learn that I wasn't the pushover she'd made me out to be. That night, I went home, walked in with a steady confidence I hadn't felt in months. I looked at her, watched her move around the kitchen, completely unaware of what was coming, and I felt a sense of closure settle over me. The life I'd thought we had, the love I'd thought was real, it was all gone. All that was left was the truth, and I was ready to face it head on, no matter how much it hurt. Part 5. Revenge. I'll be honest, revenge wasn't something I'd ever pictured myself seeking. But after what Lynette had put me through, it felt less like revenge and more like reclaiming a part of myself she'd tried to destroy. After weeks of playing the role, smiling at her fake kindness, pretending like I hadn't already checked out of our marriage, it was time to take back control. So, when she announced she'd be heading out of town again for another business trip, I didn't ask questions. I just smiled and told her to have a great time, knowing full well that this was the last time she'd get to fool me with her lies. The moment she walked out the door, I took a deep breath, steeling myself for what I had planned. I wasn't going to sit at home waiting for her to come back. No, tonight was going to be different. I grabbed my keys and drove downtown to one of the city's more popular nightclubs. The place was buzzing, packed with people looking for a good time. It felt strange at first, being out there with all those strangers, like I'd stepped into another world. But soon, I found myself relaxing, letting the noise and the energy wash over me. I wasn't here for anything serious. I was here to remind myself that I still had a life outside of her, that I didn't have to be the sad, betrayed husband forever. And that's when I met Amber and Naomi. They were both stunning, each in their own way. Amber with her wild, dark curls and bold red lipstick, and Naomi with her easy smile and piercing blue eyes. They were friends just out for a night of fun, and the moment we struck up a conversation, I felt like a weight had lifted. For the first time in weeks, I found myself laughing, genuinely laughing, as we talked about everything from the terrible music playing to the overpriced drinks. They didn't hide their interest, and I didn't try to play coy either. After a couple of drinks, Amber nudged me with a mischievous grin. "So, are you just going to stand here all night? Or are you planning to actually show us around?" I chuckled, feeling a thrill of spontaneity I hadn't felt in years. "Why don't we take this party somewhere else?" I suggested, barely believing my own words. They exchanged glances, then nodded in agreement. And just like that, I found myself inviting them back to my house. A place that had once felt like a prison, but now felt like the perfect setting to take back a little bit of my own life. On the way back, I'll admit, I had my doubts. Part of me wondered if I was sinking to Lynette's level, but then I thought about everything I'd been through, everything she'd put me through, and those doubts faded away. This wasn't about hurting her. This was about breaking free from the grip she'd had on me. We got to my place, and I made sure to leave the front door open, just in case Lynette decided to make an early return. It was late enough that I didn't expect her for hours, but I wanted her to see this. I wanted her to know that I was done playing by her rules. Amber and Naomi settled onto the couch, laughing as they teased each other, and I joined them, enjoying the lightheartedness they brought. We shared more drinks, joked around, and for a few hours, I forgot about the mess my life had become. I forgot about the betrayal, the lies. All I felt was the warmth of their laughter and the freedom of not caring for once. Then, right on cue, I heard the sound of the door. Lynette walked in, looking exhausted but happy, like she'd just had the time of her life. And then she froze. She took in the scene, me, sitting between Amber and Naomi, laughing like I didn't have a care in the world. The shock on her face was priceless. "What the hell is going on here?" she snapped, her eyes darting between me and the two women. I leaned back, barely suppressing a smirk. "Oh, Lynette," I said, voice dripping with calm. "You're back early. Hope you had a productive business trip." She glared at me, her face twisted with a mix of rage and confusion. Who are these women? She demanded, gesturing wildly at Amber and Naomi. Amber chuckled, giving Lynette a once-over with a sly smile. We're friends of Dexter's. Isn't that right, Dex? I nodded, enjoying the look of disbelief on Lynette's face. She started to say something, but I held up a hand to stop her. No need to make a scene, Lynette. After all, you don't own the exclusive rights to late-night adventures, do you? Her face went pale, and I could see the panic setting in as she realized what I was hinting at. She sputtered, struggling to form a coherent sentence. I can't believe this. How could you bring strangers into our home? Into our marriage? I laughed, the bitterness finally spilling out. Our marriage? I shook my head. Oh, come on, Lynette. I know everything. The dinners, the hotels, the lies. Don't act like you're the victim here. I'm just leveling the playing field. Now we're even, wouldn't you say? She stared at me, open-mouthed, clearly not expecting this. Her anger quickly turned to indignation as she pointed a trembling finger at me. This is childish, Dexter. You think this makes us even? You're just being petty. Maybe, I said, shrugging, but after all the humiliation you put me through, it feels pretty damn good. Naomi chuckled beside me, exchanging an amused glance with Amber. The two of them seemed to enjoy watching Lynette squirm, and their laughter only made her angrier. You're going to regret this, she hissed, her voice a low growl. You think you can just humiliate me in front of strangers? I met her glare, my own calm and steady. Why not? You had no problem humiliating me behind my back, telling your friends how clueless I was, how much of a fool you thought I was. Now you get to feel a little of that yourself. Her face flushed red, and I could see the shame mingling with her anger. She took a step back, looking between me and the two women, clearly unsure of what to do. But I was done. I'd finally said my piece, and there was no going back now. Turning to Amber and Naomi, I raised my glass. To honesty, I said, and they both laughed, clinking their glasses with mine, unfazed by the scene unfolding before them. Lynette stormed out, slamming the door behind her, but I didn't chase after her. I didn't feel the need to explain myself, to justify what I'd done. For the first time in years, I felt free, like I'd finally taken back some part of myself she'd tried to bury. And as I sat there with Amber and Naomi, laughing at the absurdity of it all, I knew that this was just the beginning of my new life. The morning I filed for divorce was strangely quiet. After all the chaos and confrontation, after the bitterness and betrayal, it felt almost surreal to finally be taking this step. I'd thought there'd be more emotion, more anger, maybe even some regret. But all I felt was relief, a long, overdue release from the life I'd been trapped in. The decision was made, and there was no turning back. Predictably, Lynette didn't take it well. When she received the papers, she showed up at my door, all teary-eyed and apologetic, begging for a second chance. She tried everything, said it was just an emotional phase, a moment of weakness. She painted herself as a victim of her own mistakes, desperately hoping I'd buy into her story one last time. But I was done buying her lies. She didn't get to walk away from this with a pity party. I can change, Dexter, she pleaded, her voice trembling. We can start over. Make this work. I looked at her, feeling a strange sense of detachment. There's nothing left to start over with, Lynette. You made sure of that. Realizing that her tears wouldn't work, she quickly shifted gears, pushing for an amicable settlement. She hinted that we could part as friends, that we didn't need to drag this through court. But I wasn't interested in letting her off the hook. She made a mockery of our marriage, and she wasn't about to waltz out of this unscathed. My lawyer, a no-nonsense, sharp-as-a-blade guy, helped me secure favorable terms for asset division. Every bit of evidence I'd gathered played a crucial role in the proceedings, and in court, I laid it all out. Photos, messages, hotel bills. Every betrayal was documented, piece by piece. Watching her squirm in front of our friends and family was almost cathartic. She tried to look remorseful, but there was no sympathy left for her. Not from me, and certainly not from anyone who saw what she'd done. Lynette's reputation took a hard hit. Her attempts to spin it as an emotional journey or a personal growth phase only made people avoid her even more. I cut off all contact with her. I'd been dragged through enough, and I wasn't about to give her the satisfaction of reopening old wounds. She tried to reach out through mutual friends, even sent a few long-winded messages talking about how she'd found herself and was ready to heal together. I deleted them without a second thought. She was a past, a closed chapter. Once the divorce was finalized, I felt like I could finally breathe again. It was time to focus on myself, to figure out who I was outside of the mess Lynette had left behind. I took a hard look at my life and started making changes, small but meaningful. I joined a gym, something I put off for years, and started going every morning. It wasn't just about the workouts. It was a way to clear my head, to get my mind right after everything I'd been through. I signed up for a few classes too, things I'd always been interested in but had never gotten around to doing. Cooking, swimming, even a photography workshop. Every new hobby, every skill I picked up felt like reclaiming a piece of myself I'd lost along the way. I was done being the guy defined by someone else's betrayal. I was done being Lynette's ex-husband, the guy who got cheated on. I was becoming Dexter again, on my own terms. A few months down the line, I met Skylar. She was different, down-to-earth, sharp, and honest. She had this calmness about her, a quiet confidence that I found refreshing. We met at the gym, and what started as a casual friendship soon became something more. She knew about my past, about what Lynette had done, and she respected that I wasn't in any rush. There was no pressure, no hidden agendas, just two people who genuinely enjoyed each other's company. Being with Skylar felt different from the start. With her, there were no mind games, no hidden motives. I could trust her, and for the first time in a long while, I felt like I didn't have to keep my guard up. I could just be. We'd spend hours talking, sharing stories, laughing about the little things. It was easy, real. Everything I hadn't realized I'd been missing all those years with Lynette. Looking back now, I can see that Lynette's betrayal, as painful as it was, taught me something valuable. It stripped away the illusions, forced me to confront the things I'd ignored, the red flags I'd brushed aside. I'd been so focused on building a life with someone else that I'd forgotten to look after myself, to make sure I was actually happy. Now I was living a life that felt like mine. I'd rebuilt my confidence, my sense of self-worth, and I knew what I wanted in a partner, what I deserved. I wasn't going to settle for anything less than trust, respect, and honesty. In the end, Lynette's betrayal didn't break me. It woke me up, gave me a clarity I'd never had before. And as much as I'd loved her once, I was glad to be free. Free from the lies, the deception, the endless games. Free to live a life that was my own, not one tainted by someone else's choices. Sitting here now, next to Skylar, I can finally look back without bitterness. I've moved on, made peace with the past. It's not the story I'd have chosen, but it's the one that led me here, to a life that's real, grounded, and mine.